Hi Year 12, this lecture is looking at ethnicity and crime. It's a topic that we've covered already when we've looked at other theories of crime, but there are plenty of statistical evidence that you should be collecting to support your points in your exam. So, official statistics suggest that black ethnic groups are by far overrepresented in crime statistics. Black ethnic groups only make up 2.7% of the entire population over 10 in this country in 2008, but they account for 7.4% of all arrests and 13% of stop and searches, 6.5% of cautions, 27% of the prison population. Asian groups are slightly overrepresented, whereas white groups are underrepresented across all of the criteria. And in the red box are some interesting facts about stop and search. There are two explanations for these trends. First, the fact that black people do commit more crime. And I'd like you to think about the theories that we've looked at. Who would agree that black people commit more crime, and who would be able to explain why they commit more crime? The second explanation is that black people are not committing more crime, but they are more likely to be targeted by the police and therefore appear in the statistics more often. So again, consider what theoretical perspectives would back up this argument. But what does get underreported is that ethnic minorities are also more likely than white British people to be the victims of crime. So, why might they have higher rates of offending than other ethnic groups? Explanations generally can be linked to the explanations we've looked at for class. Okay, we're going to look at gender next. Okay, but there are also age differences in crimes. Okay. And what's the impact of each of these characteristics on crime? So can you just take a quick note on how can class affect criminality, how can gender affect criminality, and how can age affect criminality? One of the best theories for explaining why black people commit more crime, or appear to commit more crime, are Lee and Young from the Left Realists. And they argue that we can explain ethnic minority crime not just black crime, in reference to three concepts: relative deprivation, marginality, and the formation of subcultures. Now, if you can just remind yourself what those three terms stand for, and how do you think they might be able to explain black crime? On the following three slides, which you can pause, I've annotated as much as I can think of for each of those three explanations, as well as looking at some other explanations. So please flick through them and pause and add the notes according to each of those three explanations for why ethnic minorities commit crime. Gun crime is always in the news, and when we speak about gun crime, it tends to be considered a black-on-black issue. But this involves the involvement of other ethnic minority groups. Gun crime actually only totals about 0.2% of total offences in 2008. So actually it's not as big a problem as maybe we are led to believe. And you might want to consider, why is it that we know so much about gun crime? Okay, why is it reported more often? What these statistics tend to cover up is the fact that 75% of all victims of firearm homicides or murders are from the African Caribbean community. So again, it's changing the focus of the argument away from black people as perpetrators of gun crime, and actually consider them maybe more often as victims of gun crime. 79% of all suspects come from the African Caribbean community. And it's very often treated as a black-on-black problem that the police shouldn't and can't actually get involved in. Have a quick look at this table, and what is it telling you? Now remember, the black community only forms 2.7% of the total population, or did in 2008, and it has gone up since then, but not significantly. Okay, so the light pink's any offence, and the dark purple's any serious offence. So, are the statistics accurate? Well, clearly not. We need to look at other forms of statistics. We've got to remember that official crime statistics all come from police officers recording crime being reported, and we know that there are certain issues with police officers recording crime accurately and people reporting crime in the first place. So how can we find out more accurate data on ethnic minority crime and the types of offences or offenders? There are two different sources other than official crime statistics. The first one's victim surveys. These are sent out annually, and people reflect on the year past and have to say whether they've been a victim of particular different types of crimes. Things like, has anything been stolen from your house? Has anything been stolen from your car? Have you been assaulted in the street? All of those sorts of crimes. The problem is that they rely on memory. They're only personal crimes, so crimes that can actually happen against you, not things like white-collar crimes. Excludes under 16s as well, which is a bit unfair because when you think about the people who are much more likely to be the victims of violent crime and possibly robbery, quite a lot of young people are much more likely to be victims in those areas. There's also self-report studies where respondents can admit to committing certain types of crimes. But it is worth considering how likely are you to gain access to certain criminal groups who are perhaps involved in organised crime, gang crime, crime over territory. How likely are you to be able to get access to those groups? So why is it that the ethnic minority seems to appear in the statistics more often? Well, one of the main areas is the idea of targeting or labelling by the police. This can be known as racism or institutional racism in the criminal justice system. Now, we've already looked at Paul Gilroy, if you remember his study, The Myth of Black Criminality, page 115 in your books. The idea, what he argued, was that black people were no more criminal than white people. It's just that because of racial stereotypes, the police were more likely to target black people in the community. Okay, things like stop and search are a very good example of this. On the other hand, he did argue that black criminality was a form of political resistance against a racist society. So in the same way that working class crime is resisting capitalism, he said black crime is resisting racism. And he traced this back to the legacy of slavery, which is a little bit far-fetched. The study that you guys hopefully remember a bit better is Stuart Hall, Policing the Crisis, on black muggers. He argued that moral panics basically served the interests of capitalism when they're facing crises. So in the 1970s, there was high unemployment. And so they created the moral panic of black muggers as a scapegoat. Mugging is now typically associated with black youth as a result of the continuous and over-reporting of the media. Muggings didn't actually increase from the 1960s. They stayed at a constant level, but the media over-reported and over-exaggerated. This then divided the working class on racial grounds, so they could not form a unified front against the capitalist employers that are exploiting them, and actually increased the marginalisation of youth, the black youth, and drove them into a lifestyle of crime because, they couldn't achieve in schools because of their labels, they couldn't get jobs because of their labels, which essentially forced them into these anti-society subcultures. The key thing is left realists are critical of Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy to the extent they say that fear of mugging is actually justified and it's a genuine fear and needs to be dealt with. At the back of your PowerPoint, I've actually given you an outline of the 1999 Macpherson's report on the police investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. If you're not sure who Stephen Lawrence is, please Google that name right now to find out a bit more about his case. This concluded that the police force was institutionally racist and it was widespread. So please read the article and annotate and answer those few questions at the bottom. This is a picture of Stephen Lawrence. Hopefully some of you do recognise this. He was murdered in 1993 and the police investigation was an absolute sham. There were talks of corruption, being bribed by the white men's families that actually did the stabbing. It was unprovoked. He was just waiting for a bus. It was a really terrible, terrible story. And the police would not deal with the case. And actually, here's some of the U's at the bottom there on the right-hand side. These are the group of men that were actually accused of his murder. Now, I think 2 of them are finally being convicted, but that only happened last year. Other aspects of the criminal justice system are also institutionally racist. They are much more like ethnic minorities are much more likely to appear in statistics at the stop and search stage the number of arrests, the numbers that are prosecuted, so actually charged and prosecuted, the numbers that are sentenced, okay, so the ones that are actually found guilty, the numbers that are imprisoned as opposed to being given community service, and as a result, this all feeds into Home Office data about the levels of criminality. Now, what happens if official statistics say that black youths are more criminal than any other groups? Okay, what impact does that have on what goes on in the streets? And there's a few more statistics there in the red box that you could add to your PowerPoint. It's also worth considering the participation of ethnic minorities in the criminal justice system as employees, and they are severely underrepresented. They form only 3% of High Court judges, and they are very much underrepresented at all levels of the criminal justice system, even the police force. Okay, so this isn't just black, which are at 2.7%, but the whole entire population of ethnic minorities, which are around about 13%. What does this poster suggest about sentencing? So sentencing is what takes place in the court. So this isn't the police, this is the magistrates and the judges. What does this poster suggest about sentencing? As I mentioned before, what tends to be ignored in many stories about black crime, so to speak, or ethnic minority crime, is the number of ethnic minorities that are victims. The British Crime Survey shows that 27% of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are likely to be victims of crime. This compares with 25% for whites. South Asian groups are 4 times more likely to be victims of a racist attack than whites. 10% of all murder victims are black, okay, when you consider their proportion of the population is 2.7, and some 7% of victims are Asian. 1 in 3 black murder victims were shot, compared with 1 in 10 Asians and 1 in 20 whites. And there are 2 aspects or explanations for this that you need to focus on. Racist incidents, the idea is that there are plenty of examples of racially motivated crimes. Like a Bangladeshi is 14 times more likely to be a victim of a racially motivated offence than a white person. And the idea that ethnic minorities are victimised in our society, and as a result this leads to a very genuine fear of crime. They're sometimes, most of them tend to live in poorer areas, and as a result they may feel that they do not benefit from the positive control of a good neighbourhood. Here are some studies on British Asian crime. If you could just make a few notes on your PowerPoint. Not much research has been done on Asian crime because many perceive the black community as being more of a social problem. Well, this isn't entirely accurate. The Bradford riots are a good example when the Asian population reacted against an English Defence League march, which was demanding that all Asians be thrown out of the country, that they shouldn't have houses and they shouldn't get any of the jobs. It was a really nasty, nasty protest, and it triggered the Bradford riots when the Asian community fought back. If you could please annotate the following arguments about Muslims, terrorism and Islamophobia on your PowerPoint, I'd appreciate it, as I can't increase the size of this video much further. Thanks. So, to conclude, Bowling and Phillips argue that ethnic minority crime is closely related to social exclusion, very similar to the arguments of left realism, due to anomie, strain, and social disorganisation. Why are they more likely to suffer anomie? Why are they more likely to suffer strain? There is much evidence that black people are criminalised through the criminal justice system, and both of these reinforce each other, and we should not ignore the fact that many ethnic minority groups are subject to being victims of crime, but this is largely hidden by the media. Thank you, Year 13.